The sound of galloping hooves echoed through the dusty canyon, each thunderous beat matching the frantic rhythm of Hope Taylor's heart. Blood trickled down her arm where the bullet had grazed her, but she couldn't stop, not now, not when freedom was so tantalizingly close. The year was 1878, and in the unforgiving New Mexico territory, a woman alone might as well be wearing a target on her back. "There she is," a gruff voice shouted from behind. "Don't let her reach the crossing." Hope urged her exhausted mare forward, the poor creature's flanks heaving with exertion. 3 days, she'd been running from Silas Crawford, and his men 3 days since she'd overheard their plan to rob the Santa Fe bank and murder the sheriff. 3 days since they'd discovered her hiding in the storeroom. The horizon blurred through her tears as the canyon walls began to narrow. She'd taken a wrong turn. The realization hit her like a physical blow. There would be no crossing here, no escape route, just a dead end waiting to swallow her whole. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, and she instinctively ducked lower in the saddle. Her mare whinnied in panic, nearly throwing her as a bullet kicked up dust mere inches from its hooves. "You can run all you want, girl," Crawford's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "But there ain't nowhere to hide." Hope rounded a bend in the canyon, and her heart nearly stopped. Before her stood a tall figure on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. Another of Crawford's men, cutting off her escape. This was it. She was trapped. She yanked on the reins, desperate to find another way, but her mare reared in confusion. As Hope struggled to maintain control, she got her first clear look at the rider ahead. He wasn't one of Crawford's men. His features were cast in shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in stubble and piercing eyes that assessed the situation in an instant. "Behind you," she cried, gesturing frantically at the approaching riders. The stranger's gaze shifted to the dust cloud behind her, then back to her face. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and urged his stallion forward, positioning himself between Hope and her pursuers. "Get behind me," he commanded, his voice low and steady. "They'll kill you," Hope protested, even as she guided her mare behind his larger mount. The stranger's eyes never left the approaching riders as he replied, "I'll be your shield, madam. Now stay back." Crawford and his men rounded the bend, 5 riders in all, pulling up short when they spotted the lone cowboy blocking their path. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "This don't concern you, mister," Crawford called out, his hand hovering near his holster. "That woman's a thief, stole something valuable from me. Is that right?" the stranger replied, seeming almost bored by the accusation. "Must be mighty valuable for 5 men to chase one woman across the territory." Hope clutched her reins tighter. "He's lying. I overheard them planning to rob the bank in Santa Fe. They're going to kill the sheriff." Crawford spat on the ground. "She's spinning tales." "Now step aside or join her in the grave." The stranger didn't flinch. 5 against 1, those aren't friendly odds." His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but I've never been much for arithmetic. In the blink of an eye, his revolver was leveled at Crawford. "I suggest you boys turn around and forget whatever business you think you have with this lady." Crawford's face contorted with rage. "You're making a mistake, friend." "I'm not your friend," the stranger replied coldly. "And the only mistake here would be thinking I won't put a bullet between your eyes if you don't ride away. Now." The tension stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. Hope held her breath, certain that at any moment, gunfire would erupt and they'd both be dead. But something in the stranger's stance, the steady hand holding the revolver, the unflinching gaze gave Crawford pause. After a long, tense moment, he jerked his head at his men. "This ain't over," he growled, wheeling his horse around. "We'll be seeing you both real soon." As quickly as they had appeared, the riders vanished back into the canyon, the sound of their retreat echoing off the rock walls. Only when the dust had settled did the stranger holster his weapon and turn to face Hope. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes falling to the bloodstain on her sleeve. Just a graze, she replied, suddenly very aware of how disheveled she must look after days on the run. Thank you, they would have killed me. He nodded once, studying her face as if measuring the truth in her words. Name's Asher Blackwood, he said finally, tipping his hat. Might I ask what you're doing out here alone with those men on your tail? Hope hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But this man had just risked his life for her. She owed him the truth. Hope Taylor, she offered. I worked at the Silver Dollar Saloon in Willow Creek. 3 nights ago, I was cleaning up after closing when Crawford and his men came in. They didn't know I was there, and I overheard them planning to rob the bank in Santa Fe next week, when they spotted me. She shuddered. I've been running ever since. Asher's expression darkened. Crawford's got a reputation, mean as a rattler and twice as deadly. He glanced back in the direction the men had disappeared. They won't give up easy. Where were you headed? Santa Fe, Hope replied. I need to warn the sheriff. Asher considered this, then nodded. Santa Fe's still 2 days' ride, and your horse is about done in. He gestured to her exhausted mare. My cabin's not far. You can rest there tonight, and I'll take you to Santa Fe tomorrow. Hope eyed him warily. The stranger had saved her life, true, but she hadn't survived this long by being trusting. Why would you help me? A ghost of a smile touched Asher's lips. Let's just say I've got no love for Crawford and his kind. Besides, he added, his expression softening slightly, my ma raised me to help a lady in distress. Something about his straightforward manner reassured her, and truthfully, she had few options. Her mare was at the end of her strength, and Hope herself wasn't far behind. Thank you, she said finally. I accept your offer. Asher nodded, satisfied. Follow me. We should get off this trail before Crawford decides to test his luck. As they rode side by side through the gathering dusk, Hope couldn't help stealing glances at her rescuer. He sat tall in the saddle, alert and watchful, his profile strong against the darkening sky. She didn't know what twist of fate had placed him in her path at precisely the right moment, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel something other than terror. Hope. Asher's cabin was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pines, the structure solid and well-maintained. A small corral stood nearby, and a stream bubbled past just beyond the trees. As they approached, Hope noted the smoke curling from the chimney. You have company. She asked, suddenly tense again. Asher shook his head. Banked the fire before I left this morning, habit of mine. He dismounted in one fluid motion, then moved to help her down. Hope hesitated only briefly before placing her hands on his shoulders, allowing him to lift her from the saddle. The contact was brief, but she felt the strength in his grip, the solid reliability of him. Thank you, she murmured, stepping back quickly. Asher nodded, then led both horses to the corral. I'll see to them. Make yourself at home. The cabin was simple but tidy, one main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves lined with supplies. Hope stood awkwardly in the center, unsure what to do with herself. When Asher returned, he moved directly to the fireplace, stoking the embers and adding fresh logs. You must be hungry, he said, not looking up from his task. I could eat, Hope admitted. In truth, she was famished, having rationed her meager supplies over the past 3 days. There's stew in the pot. Been simmering all day. He straightened, regarding her thoughtfully. And you should tend to that arm. Hope glanced down at her bloodied sleeve. It's nothing serious. Wounds out here have a way of turning serious if you don't mind them, he replied, moving to a trunk near the bed. He withdrew a clean shirt and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. There's water in the basin. You can clean up while I check the perimeter. When he'd gone, Hope carefully removed her tattered jacket and rolled up her sleeve. The bullet had indeed only grazed her, but the wound was angry and red. She washed it thoroughly, wincing at the sting, then wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth from the bundle Asher had provided. His shirt engulfed her slender frame, but it was clean and smelled faintly of pine and smoke, not unpleasant. She felt almost human again by the time Asher returned. If he noticed the change in her appearance, he gave no sign of it, simply moving to the fireplace and ladling stew into 2 wooden bowls. They ate in silence for several minutes, Hope too focused on the first real meal she'd had in days to make conversation. Finally, she set down her spoon. "You're a good cook," Asher shrugged. "Simple food for simple needs. Have you lived here long?" she asked, curious about this solitary man who had come to her rescue. 5 years. He took a drink from his cup. "Came west after the war, tried my hand at ranching for a spell, but—" He trailed off, something dark flickering behind his eyes. "Prefer my own company these days." "The war changed a lot of men," Hope observed quietly. Asher's gaze sharpened. "You lost someone, my father, Shiloh." She looked down at her bowl. "He went to fight for the Union, never came home." Asher was silent for a long moment. "I was at Shiloh," he said finally, his voice low. "Bloodiest 2 days of my life." Hope looked up, meeting his eyes across the table. She saw recognition there, the shared understanding of loss that needed no further explanation. "What about your mother?" he asked, changing the subject. "Died when I was 16. Fever." Hope traced a pattern on the wooden table. "I've been on my own since then. Worked as a seamstress in St. Louis for a while, then headed west when that dried up. Ended up at the Silver Dollar." "As a seamstress?" Asher asked, one eyebrow raised slightly. Hope bristled. "Yes, as a seamstress. I mend the girls' dresses and help in the kitchen. Not that it's any of your concern what I do." To her surprise, Asher smiled a genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines and lighting his eyes. "No offense meant, Miss Taylor. Just checking." The sudden warmth in his expression caught her off guard, and Hope felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She looked away, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar sensation. "What about Crawford?" she asked, steering the conversation to safer ground. "You said you knew of him." Asher's smile vanished. "He and his gang have been terrorizing settlements from here to the Arizona border. Robbery, extortion, worse." His jaw tightened. 2 months back, they raided a homestead near Silver City. Killed the man, took what they wanted. Left the wife and children with nothing. Hope shuddered. "And no one stops them? Territory's big, laws spread thin." Asher shrugged, but his eyes were hard. "Most folks keep their heads down, hope trouble passes them by. But not you." He met her gaze steadily. "I don't go looking for trouble, but I don't run from it either." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, an owl hooted softly in the darkness. "You should get some rest," Asher said, rising from the table. "Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." Hope started to protest, but the bone-deep weariness of the past days caught up with her all at once. "Wake me if they come," she said, moving toward the narrow bed. "I will," he promised, "but they won't find us tonight." As Hope settled onto the surprisingly comfortable mattress, she watched Asher check his revolver before setting it within easy reach. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to vigilance, to always being prepared. "Asher," she said softly, as he spread a blanket near the hearth. He looked up, waiting. "Thank you for everything." He nodded once, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Sleep well, Miss Taylor." Despite her fears, exhaustion claimed Hope quickly. The last thing she remembered was the solid presence of Asher Blackwood sitting guard by the fire, his profile etched against the dancing flames. Hope dreamed of endless running through canyons that twisted and turned, but never led to safety. Crawford's laughter echoed all around her, and no matter how fast she fled, the sound of hoofbeats grew ever closer. "Got you now," Crawford's voice hissed in her ear, and she felt rough hands closing around her throat. She awoke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in the unfamiliar bed. For a moment, panic seized her until the events of the previous day rushed back the canyon, the standoff, Asher. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window. Hope looked around, heart still racing from the nightmare, and found Asher already awake, cooking something over the fire. "Bad dreams?" he asked without turning. Hope pushed her tangled hair from her face. "How could you tell? You were talking in your sleep, calling out." Now he did look at her, his expression concerned. "Crawford," she nodded, embarrassed. "Just a dream." "Dreams have a way of speaking truth," Asher replied, turning his attention back to the pan. "Coffee's ready if you want some." Hope rose from the bed, smoothing Asher's borrowed shirt as best she could. She poured coffee into a tin cup and sat at the table, watching as Asher expertly flipped flapjacks in the cast iron skillet. "You're up early," she observed. "Always am." He slid a plate of flapjacks in front of her. "Habit from ranching days. Besides, wanted to check the area at first light." Hope's hand paused halfway to her mouth. "And nothing. No sign of Crawford or his men." Asher sat across from her with his own plate. "But that doesn't mean they've given up." "We should leave for Santa Fe as soon as possible," Hope said, resuming her meal. The flapjacks were delicious, light and golden, drizzled with honey. Asher nodded. "After breakfast, it's a full day's ride if we push hard." They ate in companionable silence. Hope found herself studying Asher when he wasn't looking the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, the strength in his hands as he handled his utensils, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. In the clear light of day, she could see that his eyes were a deep blue, like the sky just before dusk. He was handsome, she realized with a small start. Not in the polished way of the gamblers who frequented the Silver Dollar, but in a rugged, weathered manner that spoke of a life lived outdoors, of hardship faced and overcome. "Something wrong with the food?" Asher asked, catching her stare. Hope blinked, heat rising to her cheeks. "No." "No, it's wonderful. I was just thinking about Santa Fe," he prompted. "Yes," she lied, grateful for the suggestion. "I'm not sure what to do once we get there. Will the sheriff believe me? I have no proof of what Crawford's planning." Asher considered this. "Sheriff Daniels is a good man. Fair-minded. If we explain the situation, he'll listen." He took a sip of coffee. "But Crawford has friends in high places, bought some, intimidated others. So even if the sheriff believes me, Crawford might still get away with it," Hope concluded grimly. "Maybe." Asher's expression hardened. "But not if I have anything to say about it." There was something in his tone, a personal edge to his determination that caught Hope's attention. "You know Crawford beyond his reputation, don't you?" Asher was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls. Just when Hope thought he wouldn't answer, he spoke. "That homestead I mentioned near Silver City, it belonged to my friend, Thomas Walker, served with him during the war." Asher's voice was controlled, but Hope could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. "His wife and I were the ones who found him. Crawford had shot him in the back." "I'm so sorry," Hope said softly. Asher's jaw tightened. "I promised his widow I'd see justice done. Been tracking Crawford's movements ever since, waiting for a chance to bring him in." His eyes refocused on Hope. "Your testimony might be exactly what we need." "Then we'd better get to Santa Fe," Hope said with newfound determination. They worked together to clean up after breakfast, then prepared for the journey. Asher insisted on checking Hope's wound before they left, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he examined the angry red line on her arm. "Healing clean," he pronounced. "Keep it covered until we reach town." While Asher saddled the horses, Hope changed back into her own clothes, now somewhat cleaner after she'd washed them the night before. She felt strangely reluctant to part with his shirt, but folded it neatly and placed it on the bed. The morning air was crisp and clear as they set out, the sun climbing steadily in a cloudless sky. Asher led the way, setting a brisk pace but remaining vigilant, often pausing to study the landscape ahead or listen for sounds that didn't belong. "Tell me about yourself," Hope said as they rode side by side across a wide mesa. "You know my story, but I know very little about you." Asher glanced at her, seeming uncomfortable with the attention. "Not much to tell." "I doubt that," Hope countered. "Where did you grow up?" After a brief hesitation, he answered. Pennsylvania. Small town called Riverdale. My father was a blacksmith. And your mother, the one who taught you to help ladies in distress. Hope pressed, smiling slightly. A hint of warmth touched Asher's expression. She was a schoolteacher. Taught me to read before I even started school. Had me reciting Shakespeare when other boys were still playing with sticks. His smile faded. Lost her to consumption when I was 12. So we're both orphans, Hope observed quietly. Asher nodded. My father remarried a year later. His new wife had little use for me, left home at 16, worked odd jobs until the war broke out. He shrugged. You know the rest. Not all of it, Hope said. How did you end up here, alone in this territory? Asher was silent for so long that Hope thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if recalling events from another lifetime. After the war, I drifted, couldn't settle anywhere. The things I'd seen done. He shook his head. Nightmares were bad, started drinking to quiet them. That path leads nowhere good. Hope remained silent, sensing there was more to the story. Ended up in Denver. Was in a bad way when Thomas Walker found me, recognized me from our regiment. He'd bought land out here, was looking for help establishing his ranch. Asher's gaze swept across the landscape. The open country healed something in me. The work was hard, but honest. For the first time since the war, I could sleep without seeing dead men's faces. What happened to the ranch after Thomas died? Hope asked gently. His widow sold it, took the children back east to her family. A muscle worked in Asher's jaw. I stayed on for a while, helped with the sale, then bought my piece of land, built the cabin. And became a hermit, Hope concluded. Asher shot her a look, something almost like amusement in his eyes. I prefer solitary man of independent means. Hope laughed, the sound startling her. How long had it been since she'd laughed? The realization sobered her quickly. What about you? Asher asked. What brings a woman like you to a place like Willow Creek? A woman like me, Hope repeated, arching an eyebrow. Educated, well-spoken. Asher clarified. You don't fit the usual pattern of those who end up working in saloons. Hope considered deflecting the question, but found herself wanting to share her story with this man who had opened up to her. After my mother died, I tried to make a living as a seamstress in St. Louis. The work was steady at first, but then the shop closed. She sighed. I answered an advertisement for a position out west housekeeper for a wealthy rancher, used nearly all my savings for the stagecoach fare. Let me guess, Asher said grimly. There was no position. Hope nodded. The wealthy rancher turned out to be a man who recruited women for his establishments. When I refused that line of work, he left me stranded in Willow Creek with barely enough money for a meal. Her voice hardened with the memory. The owner of the Silver Dollar Misses. Holloway found me crying outside the general store. She offered me legitimate work, mending costumes and helping in the kitchen. Decent of her, Asher commented. She's a good woman, despite her profession, Hope said defensively. Treats her girls fairly, doesn't allow rough handling. She gave me a chance when no one else would. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun climbed higher, beating down with increasing intensity. Around midday, they stopped by a small creek to rest the horses and eat some of the provisions Asher had packed. As Hope sat on a sun-warmed rock, watching Asher check their surroundings with habitual caution, she was struck by how quickly she'd come to trust this man. In her 3 years at the Silver Dollar, she'd learned to be wary of men and their motives. Yet something about Asher Blackwood, his straightforward manner, perhaps, or the quiet integrity that seemed to guide his actions, had broken through her carefully constructed defenses. What will you do? Asher asked suddenly, settling beside her on the rock. After Santa Fe, I mean. The question caught Hope off guard. In her flight from Crawford, she hadn't thought beyond reaching safety and warning the sheriff. I'm not sure, she admitted. I can't go back to Willow Creek. Crawford knows me now. She plucked absently at a blade of grass. Maybe I'll try Albuquerque or Tucson, find work as a seamstress again. Asher nodded, his expression thoughtful. You could do that. You don't approve, Hope asked, noting something in his tone. "It's not for me to approve or disapprove," he replied carefully. "Just seems like you've been running from one place to the next for some time now." The observation stung, perhaps because of its accuracy. "Not all of us have the luxury of putting down roots, Mr. Blackwood." "No," he agreed, unperturbed by her sharp response. "But sometimes we keep moving because it's easier than staying in one place long enough to build something." Hope stared at him, torn between indignation and an uncomfortable sense that he'd seen through her in a way few people ever had. Before she could formulate a response, Asher stood. "We should keep moving," he said, offering his hand to help her up. "Still a long way to Santa Fe." The remainder of the day passed in relative silence, broken only by occasional exchanges about the route or observations about the landscape. The tension from their earlier conversation gradually dissipated, replaced by a watchful alertness as they entered more populated territory. By late afternoon, they began passing scattered homesteads and small farm signs that they were approaching civilization. Asher grew increasingly vigilant, often halting to study travelers they spotted in the distance before proceeding. "Crawford has friends everywhere," he explained when Hope questioned his caution. "Better safe than sorry." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they crested a rise, and the sprawling settlement of Santa Fe came into view. Hope felt a surge of relief at the sight of the adobe buildings gleaming golden in the late afternoon light. "We made it," she breathed. Asher's expression remained guarded. "Not quite yet. Still need to reach the sheriff's office without being spotted." They approached the town from the east, avoiding the main road in favor of a less traveled path that brought them to the outskirts as dusk was falling. Asher led them to a small livery stable off the main square. "Miguel," he greeted the stable owner, an older Mexican man who nodded in recognition. "Need to board our horses for the night." "Señor Blackwood," Miguel replied warmly. "It has been many months." His curious gaze fell on Hope. "This is Miss Taylor," Asher said simply. "We need to speak with Sheriff Daniels. Is he in town?" Miguel nodded, taking the reins of their mounts. I saw him at the cafe not 1 hour ago." He lowered his voice. "But there are strangers in town asking questions, bad men with guns." Asher's expression hardened. "Crawford?" "I did not see this Crawford," Miguel replied. "But these men, they look for a woman." His dark eyes flicked to Hope. "They offer money for information." Hope felt a chill run down her spine. Crawford's men had beaten them to Santa Fe. "Gracias, Miguel," Asher said, pressing a coin into the man's hand. "If anyone asks, I have seen no one," Miguel assured him. "The back way to the sheriff's office is clear." Asher nodded gratefully, then turned to Hope. "Stay close to me," he murmured. "Keep your head down." Heart pounding, Hope followed Asher through narrow alleyways between adobe buildings, away from the busier streets where lanterns were being lit as darkness fell. Twice they paused in shadows as men passed by, their voices carrying in the evening air. "Crawford wants her found before morning," one man said to his companion. "Says she's got information that could ruin everything." Only when the voices had faded did Asher motion for Hope to continue. Finally, they reached a small, unassuming building with a sign identifying it as the sheriff's office. "Wait here," Asher instructed, positioning Hope in the shadows beside the door. "Let me check inside first." Hope nodded, pressing herself against the adobe wall as Asher cautiously entered the building. Seconds stretched into minutes as she waited, every sound in the gathering darkness making her flinch. What if Crawford's men had already gotten to the sheriff? What if it was a trap? Just as she was about to panic, the door opened and Asher reappeared, beckoning her inside. "It's safe," he whispered. "Sheriff Daniels is here." Hope hurried into the office, blinking in the sudden lamplight. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver-streaked beard rose from behind a desk, his shrewd eyes taking in her disheveled appearance. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Asher tells me you have information about Silas Crawford." Yes, Sheriff, Hope replied, relief washing over her at being in the presence of the law. He and his men are planning to rob the bank here in Santa Fe. They mean to kill you in the process. Sheriff Daniels gestured for her to sit, his expression grave as he retook his own seat. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. For the next hour, Hope recounted the events of the past 4 days, what she'd overheard at the Silver Dollar, Crawford's pursuit, and finally her rescue by Asher in the canyon. The sheriff listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but otherwise allowing her to speak without interruption. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. This matches information I've been gathering about Crawford's movements, he said finally. He's been recruiting men, buying supplies. All signs pointed to something big in the works. Then you believe me? Hope asked, relief evident in her voice. I do, Sheriff Daniels confirmed. The question now is what to do about it. He turned to Asher. Crawford's men are all over town. Miss Taylor isn't safe here. My thoughts exactly, Asher replied grimly. We need a secure location until you can move against Crawford. The sheriff nodded, coming to a decision. There's a place-old trading post about 3 miles north of town. Been abandoned for years, but the structure's sound. Few people even remember it exists. He pulled out a piece of paper and quickly sketched a map. Take her there tonight. I'll gather my deputies and we'll come for you at first light. What about Crawford? Asher asked. I'll put the word out that we've had reports of the woman heading west toward Arizona territory, Sheriff Daniels replied. Might buy us some time. He handed the map to Asher. There are supplies cached at the trading post, food, water, ammunition. Should be enough to get you through the night if trouble comes calling. Asher studied the map, then folded it and tucked it inside his vest. We'll need fresh horses. Ours are spent. Take mine from the back, the sheriff offered. And Asher, he paused, his expression somber, if Crawford's men find you before we get there. I know, Asher replied quietly. Come on, Hope, we need to move. Outside, the town had grown quiet, most residents having retired to their homes for the evening. The main street was dimly lit by lanterns hanging outside the saloon and hotel, but the side streets were cloaked in darkness. Sheriff Daniels led them through a back door to a small corral where 2 horses stood ready. The bay is steady and strong, he told Hope. He'll carry you safely. Thank you, Sheriff, she replied, accepting his help as he boosted her into the saddle. Be careful, he warned them both. Crawford's not a man to be underestimated. Neither am I, Asher replied, swinging onto the second horse. See you at dawn, Sheriff. They rode out of town by a little-used trail, keeping to the shadows whenever possible. Hope's nerves were stretched to the breaking point, every sound in the darkness setting her heart racing. But Asher remained calm beside her, his presence a steadying force as they put distance between themselves and Santa Fe. The abandoned trading post appeared as a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, a low, sprawling adobe structure surrounded by the skeletal remains of corrals and outbuildings. As they approached, Asher held up a hand, signaling Hope to stop. Wait here, he murmured, drawing his revolver. Let me check it first. Hope watched as he dismounted and moved silently toward the building, disappearing into the shadows. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, every rustle of wind through the scrub oak sounding like approaching riders. Finally, Asher reappeared in the doorway, beckoning her forward. It's clear, he called softly. Relief flooded through Hope as she urged her horse forward. Asher helped her dismount, then led both horses to a small corral at the back of the building. There's a spring nearby, he explained as he unsaddled the animals. They'll be fine until morning. The interior of the trading post was dusty but intact, one large room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn counter, and shelves along the walls. Asher found and lit a lamp, its warm glow revealing the cache of supplies Sheriff Daniels had mentioned. We should eat something, he suggested, pulling out jerky and hardtack from a barrel. Been a long day. Hope nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. They ate a simple meal in relative silence, the day's events weighing heavily on them both. "You should try to rest," Asher said when they'd finished. "Tomorrow we'll come early." "What about you?" Hope asked, noting the shadows under his eyes. "I'll keep watch," he replied, checking his revolver methodically. "Get some sleep, Hope." She hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone in his vigil. "Wake me in a few hours. You need rest too." Asher looked up, something softening in his expression. "I will," he promised, though Hope suspected he had no intention of doing so. She found some old blankets in a chest and made a pallet near the fireplace, where Asher had started a small, smokeless fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she stared at the adobe ceiling, listening to Asher's quiet movements as he secured the building. "Asher," she called softly after a while. He appeared at her side, alert and concerned. "What is it?" "I never properly thanked you," Hope said, pushing herself up on one elbow to look at him. "For saving my life, for everything you've done." Asher shook his head, looking almost embarrassed. "No need for thanks." "There is," Hope insisted. "You risked your life for a stranger. You've protected me, guided me, kept me safe." She faltered, suddenly aware of how close he was, of the firelight playing across his features. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Some things aren't done for repayment, Hope," he said quietly, his blue eyes holding hers. For a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken connection that made Hope's heart beat faster. Then Asher cleared his throat and stood. "Try to sleep," he repeated, moving back to his position by the window. Hope settled back on her makeshift bed, her thoughts in turmoil. What was this feeling stirring within her, this awareness of Asher Blackwood that went beyond gratitude? She'd sworn off attachments after the betrayal that had stranded her in Willow Creek, had built walls around her heart for protection. Yet in the space of 2 days, this quiet, honorable man had somehow slipped past those defenses. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. The fire crackled softly, its warmth gradually lulling Hope toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was of Asher standing guard, a solitary sentinel between her and danger. She dreamed of open skies and endless horizons, of a small cabin nestled among pine trees, of a life where running was no longer necessary. When Hope awoke, the first pale light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the trading post's shuttered windows. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was and why. Asher stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the growing light. "Morning," he said, turning at the sound of her movement. "Sleep well?" Hope nodded, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. "You didn't wake me for my watch," she accused mildly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You needed the rest more than I did." "And what about what you need?" Hope challenged, rising to her feet. Something flickered in Asher's eyes, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. "I'm fine," he said, turning back to the window. "Sheriff Daniels should be here soon." Hope moved to stand beside him, peering through a crack in the shutters at the landscape outside. The trading post sat in a shallow valley, providing a clear view of the surrounding terrain. In the distance, the road from Santa Fe stretched like a ribbon across the desert. "No sign of riders yet," Asher observed, "but that doesn't mean Crawford's men aren't out there." "How did they beat us to Santa Fe?" Hope wondered aloud. "Probably split up after our encounter in the canyon," Asher replied. "Some followed us, others rode ahead to warn Crawford." He frowned. "They know you're a threat to their plans. They won't give up easily." A chill ran down Hope's spine. "Even after we reached the sheriff," Asher's expression was grim. "Crawford has money, connections. Even if he's arrested, his reach is long." He glanced at her. "You might need to consider going farther than Albuquerque or Tucson." The thought of running again, of starting over in yet another strange place, filled Hope with a bone-deep weariness. "There has to be another way," she said quietly. Before Asher could respond, a movement on the horizon caught his attention. "Riders," he said sharply, raising a spyglass to his eye. After a tense moment, he relaxed slightly. "It's Daniels, 3 men with him. Relief washed over Hope. Then it's over, we're safe. Asher's continued vigilance tempered her optimism. Let's not celebrate just yet. Stay back from the windows until I'm sure. The minutes crawled by as the riders approached. When they were within hailing distance, Sheriff Daniels called out, identifying himself. Only then did Asher move to unbar the door. The sheriff dismounted wearily, his expression grave as he entered the trading post. Miss Taylor, he greeted Hope with a nod. Glad to see you're safe. Any trouble in town? Asher asked, watching as the deputies secured the perimeter. Sheriff Daniels removed his hat, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Crawford's men were everywhere, asking questions, but no one talked, far as I can tell. And Crawford himself? Hope asked. That's the problem, the sheriff replied grimly. He's disappeared. My sources say he left town before midnight, taking several men with him. Asher's expression darkened. He knows we're onto his plan. Worse than that, Sheriff Daniels said. One of my deputies found a man shot dead near the livery Miguel Torres. Hope gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The stable owner, the one who helped us, the sheriff nodded solemnly. Looks like he was questioned first, hard. Asher's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger and grief. Miguel was a good man. Did he tell them about us? About this place? Hope asked, fear creeping back into her voice. No way to know for certain, Sheriff Daniels replied. But we should assume Crawford knows you didn't head west as we led on. He turned to Asher. You need to get Miss Taylor to safety. I've arranged passage for her on the eastbound train from Lamy. It leaves at noon. East. Hope repeated, confused. But I thought Crawford has connections throughout the territory, the sheriff explained. You'll be safer back east, at least until after the trial. Trial? Hope looked between the two men. We have enough evidence now to move against Crawford, Sheriff Daniels said. Your testimony, combined with what we've gathered over the past months, should be enough to put him away for good. But first we need to get you to that train, Asher interjected. And Crawford will be watching the roads, the sheriff nodded. That's why I brought extra men. 2 of my deputies will escort you to Lamy by the back trails. He glanced at Asher. Unless you'd prefer to handle it yourself. Asher's gaze met Hope's across the room. Something unspoken passed between them, a question, a possibility. Hope found herself holding her breath, waiting for his answer. I'll take her, Asher said finally, his eyes never leaving Hope's. All the way to wherever she needs to go. The sheriff raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on the intensity of Asher's tone. Very well. My men will create a diversion, make it appear as though Miss Taylor is being escorted back to Santa Fe. With luck, Crawford's men will follow them instead of you. The plan was quickly arranged. Hope would travel with Asher by a rarely used trail that led directly to Lamy, bypassing the main roads where Crawford might have men watching. The sheriff provided them with fresh horses, supplies, and a letter of introduction to the station master in Lamy. As they prepared to depart, Sheriff Daniels took Asher aside for a private word. Hope couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Asher nod gravely, his expression resolute. Ready? Asher asked, returning to her side as the deputies mounted up outside. Hope looked around the trading post that had sheltered them through the night, feeling a strange reluctance to leave. Here, in this dusty, forgotten place, something had shifted between her and Asher, something still undefined, but undeniably significant. Yes, she said finally, gathering her courage. I'm ready. They rode out just as the sun crested the eastern hills, Sheriff Daniels and his deputies heading south toward Santa Fe while Asher led Hope east across the open country. For the first hour, they rode in silence, both alert for any sign of pursuit. The terrain gradually changed from desert scrub to rolling hills dotted with pinon and juniper. Asher set a brisk pace, clearly familiar with the route despite its lack of obvious trail markers. How much farther to Lamy? Hope asked when they paused to rest the horses near a small spring. About 4 hours' ride, Asher replied, scanning the horizon. We should make it with time to spare. Hope watched him as he checked their back trail, noting the tension in his shoulders, the vigilance that never seemed to leave him. You don't have to come with me, you know, she said suddenly, to wherever I end up going. Asher turned, his expression unreadable. You trying to get rid of me, Miss Taylor? Despite everything, Hope smiled. No, but your life is here, your cabin, your land. I can't ask you to leave that behind. You didn't ask, he pointed out, his voice softening. I offered. Why? The question had been burning in her mind since he'd volunteered in the trading post. Why would you do that for me? Asher was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if carefully chosen. In the war, I saw men at their worst. Afterwards, I didn't much believe in anything anymore. He met her eyes. Then you came along running for your life, but still determined to warn the sheriff, to do what's right no matter the cost. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Makes a man reconsider his view of the world. Hope felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words. I'm not special, Asher, just stubborn. Maybe that's what special looks like, he replied simply. Either way, I'm not letting you face whatever comes next alone. Before Hope could respond, a sound caught Asher's attention, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats. He tensed, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Get to cover, he ordered, pointing toward a cluster of rocks and juniper. Now. Heart pounding, Hope led the horses behind the rocks while Asher took up position on a small rise, spyglass trained on the horizon. She watched his expression darken as he focused on something in the distance. Crawford, she whispered when he rejoined her. Asher nodded grimly. Him and 4 others, moving fast. He quickly gathered the reins of their mounts. They haven't spotted us yet, but they're following our trail. We need to move. They mounted up and rode hard, abandoning the trail in favor of rougher terrain where their tracks would be less visible. Asher led them through a maze of arroyos and rocky outcroppings, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. There's an old Apache route through these hills, he explained as they pushed their horses up a steep incline. Used it during the war to avoid Union patrols. If we can reach it, we might lose them. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat beating down mercilessly as they navigated the increasingly rugged landscape. Hope's muscles ached from the constant tension and exertion, but she pressed on, determined not to slow their pace. They crested a ridge and Asher pulled up sharply, surveying the valley below. There, he said, pointing to a narrow defile between 2 rocky spurs. That's our best chance. As they descended toward the passage, a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust mere feet from Hope's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating her. Ride, Asher shouted, drawing his revolver and returning fire. Get to the rocks. Hope urged her frightened mount forward as more shots echoed across the valley. She glanced back to see Asher following, exchanging fire with riders who had appeared on the ridge they'd just vacated. They reached the shelter of the defile, just as Crawford and his men began to descend the slope behind them. The narrow passage twisted between towering rock walls, barely wide enough for their horses to navigate single file. Keep going, Asher instructed, dismounting at a wider section of the passage. I'll hold them here. No, Hope protested, pulling her horse up short. I won't leave you. Asher's expression was fierce. This is the only defensible position. One man can hold it against many. He grabbed the reins of her horse, his eyes locked with hers. The passage opens onto a meadow about half a mile ahead. Wait for me there. And if you don't come. Hope demanded, fear making her voice sharp. Something softened in Asher's gaze. I'll come, he promised. Now go. Reluctantly, Hope urged her horse forward, the sound of gunfire erupting behind her as she rounded the first bend in the passage. The shots echoed off the rock walls, making it impossible to tell how many were being fired or by whom. The defile seemed to stretch endlessly, each twist and turn increasing Hope's anxiety. What if Asher was outnumbered? What if he was already wounded, or worse? When she finally emerged into the sunlit meadow he had described, Hope immediately dismounted and secured her horse to a tree. Without hesitation, she drew the small derringer Sheriff Daniels had given her and started back through the passage. The gunfire had stopped. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the previous cacophony. Hope moved cautiously, her heart in her throat as she navigated the narrow path. She rounded a bend and froze. Bodies lay sprawled across the rocky ground, two of Crawford's men, unmistakably dead. Of Asher, there was no sign. "Asher," she called softly, fear clutching at her chest. A groan from behind a boulder answered her. Hope rushed forward to find Asher sitting with his back against the rock, his left hand pressed to his right shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Told you to wait in the meadow," he grumbled, though relief showed in his eyes at the sight of her. "When have I ever done what I'm told?" Hope replied, kneeling beside him to examine the wound. "How bad is it?" Asher grimaced as she gently moved his hand away. "Bullet went through." "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." Hope tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound. "Where are the others? Crawford?" "Retreated when I took down these two," Asher replied, nodding toward the bodies. "But they'll be looking for another way around. We need to move." "You're in no condition to ride," Hope protested. "No choice," Asher said grimly, using the boulder to push himself to his feet. He swayed slightly but remained standing through sheer determination. "Crawford won't give up. Not now." Hope supported him as they made their way back to where he'd left his horse. With difficulty, she helped him mount, then swung up onto her own horse. "The train," Asher reminded her, his voice strained. "Still our best chance." They rode out of the defile into the meadow, Asher clearly struggling to stay upright in the saddle. Hope kept close beside him, ready to catch him if he faltered. "There's a cabin," he said after they'd crossed the meadow and entered a pine forest. "Old trapper's place. Not far." His words were becoming slurred, his face alarmingly pale. "Hold on," Hope urged, reaching across to steady him as he swayed. "Just tell me which way." Asher pointed vaguely northward, and Hope took the lead, constantly scanning the trees for any sign of the cabin he'd mentioned. After what seemed an eternity, a small clearing appeared ahead, and within it, a crude log structure nestled against a rocky hillside. "There," she said with relief, guiding their horses toward it. By the time they reached the cabin, Asher was barely conscious. Hope dismounted quickly and helped him down, supporting most of his weight as they stumbled to the door. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and narrow cot. Hope helped Asher to the cot, then quickly gathered what she needed to treat his wound. The cabin was surprisingly well-stocked with basic supplies, including a medical kit that contained bandages and a bottle of whiskey. "Going to have to clean it," she warned, cutting away his bloodied shirt. Asher nodded weakly. "Do what you need to." Hope steeled herself and poured whiskey over the wound. Asher's body went rigid, a strangled groan escaping through clenched teeth. "I'm sorry," she murmured, working as quickly as she could to clean and bandage the injury. "Almost done." When she'd finished, Asher lay back on the cot, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "You should secure the horses," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden Crawford." "I will," Hope assured him. "Rest now." She waited until his breathing steadied before going outside to tend to the horses. She led them to a small lean-to behind the cabin, obscured from view by dense pines. After unsaddling them and ensuring they had water from a nearby spring, she returned to check on Asher. He was asleep, his face pale against the rough blanket. Hope gently placed a hand on his forehead, relieved to find no sign of fever yet. She knew the real danger would come later. Infection was the killer in wounds like this. Moving quietly, she secured the cabin as best she could, barring the door and checking the single window. Then she built a small fire in the fireplace, mindful to keep the smoke to a minimum. As darkness fell outside, she sat beside Asher's cot, watching the rise and fall of his chest. They had missed the train to Lamy. Sheriff Daniels would be wondering what had happened to them, and Crawford was still out there, hunting them. Hope's mind raced with these thoughts as she struggled to stay awake, determined to keep watch through the night. But the events of the day, the desperate ride, the gunfight, the fear for Asher's life had drained her completely. Despite her best intentions, her eyes grew heavy, her head nodding forward as exhaustion claimed her. She dreamed of running again, but this time she wasn't alone. Asher ran beside her, his hand firmly clasping hers as they fled through an endless forest. Behind them, shadows pursued faceless, relentless. Ahead, a light beckoned, promising safety if only they could reach it. Hope. The sound of her name pulled her from the dream. She blinked awake to find early morning light filtering through the cabin window. Asher was awake, watching her with concern. "You stayed there all night?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been the previous evening. Hope straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her neck from sleeping in the chair. "I meant to keep watch," she admitted ruefully. A hint of a smile touched Asher's lips. "You needed the rest." He attempted to sit up, grimacing with the effort. "Careful," Hope admonished, moving to help him. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot," he replied dryly. His hand caught hers as she adjusted the blanket. "Thank you for coming back for me, for taking care of me." The simple sincerity in his voice made Hope's heart skip a beat. "You've been taking care of me since we met," she said softly. "It was my turn." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Asher cleared his throat, looking away. "We need to get word to Sheriff Daniels," he said. "Let him know what happened." Hope nodded, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his. "The nearest town." "Galisteo," Asher replied. "About 10 miles west, but Crawford might have men watching it." "Then what do we do?" Hope asked, moving to the fireplace to stir the embers. Asher was silent for a moment, considering their options. "There's a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Belongs to a man named Jenkins. Fought with him in the war. He'll help us get word to Daniels." "Can you ride that far?" Hope asked, concern evident in her voice. "I'll manage," Asher assured her, though the tightness around his eyes belied his confident tone. They shared a simple breakfast of hardtack and jerky from the cabin's supplies, then prepared to leave. Hope helped Asher dress, careful of his injured shoulder, then supported him as they made their way to the horses. Getting him into the saddle was a struggle that left them both breathless. Once mounted, Asher sat swaying slightly, his face pale with pain and exertion. "We can wait another day," Hope suggested, worried by his condition. Asher shook his head firmly. "Crawford won't wait. We move now." The journey to the Jenkins ranch was slow and arduous. Asher led the way, but Hope could see the toll each mile took on him. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, a substantial house, barn, and several outbuildings nestled in a green valley, he was listing dangerously in the saddle. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, rifle raised cautiously. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "That's far enough," he called out. Then, as they drew closer, recognition dawned. Asher Blackwood." "Hello, Robert," Asher replied weakly. "Could use some help." Robert Jenkins lowered his rifle and hurried forward, reaching them just as Asher began to slide from his saddle. With Hope's help, he caught Asher and supported him toward the house. "Martha," he shouted as they neared the porch. "Prepare the guest room and fetch your medical supplies." A woman appeared in the doorway, her expression changing from curiosity to alarm at the sight of Asher's condition. "Bring him in quickly," she directed, holding the door wide. Within minutes, Asher was settled in a clean bed, Martha Jenkins examining his wound with practiced efficiency. "Bullet wound's clean," she pronounced, "but he's lost a lot of blood and there's early signs of infection." She looked at Hope. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday afternoon," Hope replied. "I cleaned it as best I could." Martha nodded approvingly. "You did well. Probably saved his life." She began preparing a poultice of herbs, but he needs rest and proper care now. While Martha tended to Asher, Robert led Hope to the kitchen, where he poured her a cup of strong coffee. "Now," he said, settling across from her at the table, "suppose you tell me what kind of trouble you two are in." Hope hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Sensing her reluctance, Robert smiled kindly. "Asher Blackwood is like a brother to me," he assured her. "Saved my life at Shiloh. Whatever mess he's in, I'm on his side." Relieved, Hope told him everything: Crawford, the planned bank robbery, her flight from Willow Creek, and Asher's intervention. Robert listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Crawford," he muttered when she'd finished. "Man's a plague on this territory." He stood, decision made. "I'll ride to Santa Fe today, inform Sheriff Daniels of your situation. Martha will look after Asher. She was a nurse during the war. You'll both be safe here until he's well enough to travel." "Thank you," Hope said fervently. "I don't know how we can repay your kindness." Robert waved away her thanks. "Family doesn't need repayment." He regarded her with shrewd eyes. "Asher's been alone too long. Good to see him caring about someone again." Before Hope could respond to this observation, Martha returned to the kitchen. "He's asking for you," she told Hope. "Fever's starting, but his mind is clear for now." Hope hurried back to the guest room, where Asher lay against crisp white pillows. His face was flushed, his eyes too bright, but they focused on her as she entered. "Jenkins?" he asked, his voice strained. "He's riding to Santa Fe to warn Sheriff Daniels," Hope assured him, settling in a chair beside the bed. "You're safe here, Asher. You need to rest." He reached for her hand, his fingers burning with fever. "If anything happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you," Hope interrupted firmly. "Martha knows what she's doing. You're going to be fine." Asher's grip tightened. "Promise me, if I don't make it, you'll keep running. Get as far from Crawford as you can." Tears pricked at Hope's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere without you," she said fiercely. "So you'd better fight, Asher Blackwood. You hear me? Fight." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam," he murmured. Then his eyes drifted closed, the fever claiming him. For the next 3 days, Hope barely left Asher's side as he battled the infection that raged through his body. Martha taught her how to apply the poultices, how to coax water between his parched lips, how to sponge his burning skin with cool cloths. When the fever was at its worst, Asher called out in his delirium, sometimes shouting orders to unseen soldiers, sometimes murmuring apologies to people Hope didn't know. Once, he called her name with such anguish that tears streamed down her face as she held his hand and assured him she was there. On the morning of the 4th day, Hope awoke in her chair to find Asher watching her, his eyes clear for the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch. "You're still here," he said softly. Hope straightened, relief washing over her. "Where else would I be?" "Running," he replied simply. "It's what you do." The observation might have stung if not for the gentle way he said it and the truth behind the words. "Maybe I'm tired of running," Hope admitted, both to him and to herself. Before Asher could respond, the door opened and Martha entered, carrying a tray of food. Her face lit up at the sight of Asher awake and lucid. "Well, look who's decided to rejoin the land of the living," she said cheerfully, setting down the tray. "How do you feel?" "Weak as a kitten," Asher admitted, "but better." Martha checked his wound, nodding with satisfaction. "Infection's breaking. You're past the worst of it." She turned to Hope. "Make sure he eats something, then both of you get some proper rest." After Martha had gone, Hope helped Asher sit up against the pillows, then offered him the bowl of broth from the tray. His hands shook too much to hold it himself, so she held it for him, watching with satisfaction as he managed several spoonfuls. "Robert returned yesterday," she told him as he ate. "Sheriff Daniels is moving against Crawford. They've arrested 3 of his men in Santa Fe already." "And Crawford himself?" Asher asked, Hope's expression sobered. "Still at large, but the sheriff has men watching all the passes and trails out of the territory." Asher nodded, unsurprised. "Crawford's like a coyote, won't be easy to trap him." "The sheriff also sent this," Hope continued, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing an envelope. "It's for both of us." Curious, Asher set aside the broth and took the envelope. Inside was a letter from Sheriff Daniels, thanking them for their courage and confirming that, thanks to Hope's information, they had prevented the bank robbery and arrested several of Crawford's associates. The letter concluded with a warning. Crawford remains dangerous. I advise you both to leave the territory until he is apprehended. I have enclosed tickets for the eastbound train from Lamy, departing next Tuesday. Consider it a small token of our gratitude. Asher looked up from the letter to find Hope watching him intently. East, he said, testing the word. Been a long time since I've gone east. You don't have to come with me, Hope said quickly. Your life is here. A cabin can be rebuilt anywhere, Asher interrupted gently. But finding someone worth protecting, worth following. He reached for her hand. That's rarer than gold in these parts. Hope's heart stuttered at his words, at the warmth in his blue eyes. Asher, a commotion outside interrupted her. Shouts and the sound of running feet carried through the open window. Asher tensed, reaching instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. The door burst open and Robert Jenkins rushed in, his expression grave. Crawford, he said without preamble, he's found you. My ranch hand just rode and saw Crawford and two men approaching from the south ridge. Fear coursed through Hope, but it was quickly replaced by determination. She wouldn't run again, not this time. How long do we have? Minutes, Robert replied. Martha's preparing the wagon. We need to get you both out of here. Asher struggled to sit up further. I can ride. The hell you can, Robert retorted. You can barely sit upright. He moved to the wardrobe, pulling out clothes. Get dressed. I'll hold them off as long as possible. As Robert hurried out, Hope helped Asher dress, each movement clearly causing him pain despite his efforts to hide it. By the time they made it to the back door, Martha was waiting with a wagon, its bed filled with hay and blankets. The old mining road, she told Hope as they helped Asher into the wagon. Follow it east for 5 miles. It'll take you to the Davis homestead. They'll help you reach Lamy. Hope climbed up beside Asher, taking the reins Martha handed her. What about you and Robert? Martha's expression was resolute. Crawford has no quarrel with us. We'll be fine. She pressed a bundle into Hope's hands. Food, water, medicine for Asher's wound. Now go. Hope snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. As they rounded the barn, she caught a glimpse of Robert on the porch of the main house, rifle in hand, watching the southern ridge where dust rose from approaching riders. The mining road was little more than a rutted track winding through scrubby hills. Hope pushed the horses as fast as she dared, acutely aware of Asher's condition. He sat beside her, one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, his face set in lines of pain but his eyes alert, scanning the landscape for danger. There, he said suddenly, pointing to a fork in the road ahead. Take the left branch, it's less visible from the main trail. Hope followed his direction, guiding the wagon onto a narrower path that curved around a rocky outcropping. The terrain became rougher, the wagon jolting painfully over stones and ruts. Sorry, she murmured as Asher winced with each bump. Keep going, he urged. Distance matters more than comfort right now. They had traveled perhaps 3 miles when the sound of gunfire echoed from the direction of the Jenkins ranch. Hope's hands tightened on the reins, her heart in her throat. Robert and Martha are smart and capable, Asher finished firmly. Robert was a sharpshooter during the war. He won't be taken easily. Hope nodded, trying to draw comfort from his words as she urged the horses onward. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat beating down mercilessly as they followed the winding track through increasingly barren country. Stop, Asher said suddenly, his voice sharp with urgency. Listen. Hope pulled the wagon to a halt, straining to hear over the pounding of her own heart. At first, there was only the wind sighing through the scrub, the creak of the wagon, the breathing of the horses. Then she heard it the distant but unmistakable sound of hoofbeats, coming from behind them. Crawford, she whispered, fear clutching at her chest. Asher nodded grimly. And getting closer. We need to leave the road. The wagon won't make it through that terrain, Hope protested, gesturing to the rocky slopes on either side of the track. No choice, Asher replied, his gaze scanning the landscape. There. He pointed to a narrow ravine cutting through the hills to their left. It's rough, but the wagon might fit. It's our only chance. Hope guided the team toward the ravine, her heart in her throat as the wagon wheels bumped over increasingly uneven ground. The entrance to the ravine was barely wider than the wagon itself, the walls rising steeply on either side. Keep going, Asher encouraged as branches scraped against the sides of the wagon. If we can get far enough in, they might miss us. The ravine twisted and turned, the passage sometimes so narrow that Hope feared they would become wedged between the rocky walls. The horses grew increasingly nervous, whinnying in protest as they pulled the wagon deeper into the shadowy confines. Finally, the ravine widened into a small, sheltered hollow, hidden from the main trail by the twisting path they had followed. Hope halted the wagon, the horses blowing and stamping with relief. "We'll wait here," Asher said, his voice tight with pain from the jarring journey. "If they follow our tracks, we'll hear them coming. If not, we've lost them," Hope finished, allowing herself a small spark of hope. They sat in tense silence, listening. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, then stopped. Crawford and his men had reached the fork in the road. "If they take the right fork, we're safe," Asher whispered. Seconds stretched into minutes as they waited, barely breathing. Then came the sound they dreaded, hoofbeats approaching along the left fork, drawing inexorably closer to the ravine entrance. "They're coming," Hope breathed, panic rising within her. Asher's expression hardened. "Help me down," he commanded, already moving to the edge of the wagon. "Then take the reins and be ready to drive." "What are you doing?" Hope demanded, even as she helped him to the ground. Asher steadied himself against the wagon, drawing the revolver Robert had given him. "Creating a diversion," he said grimly. "When I give the signal, drive out of here as fast as you can. Head east, don't stop for anything." "No," Hope protested, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you, Hope." Asher's voice softened, his free hand coming up to touch her cheek. "You've been running your whole life. This time, let me give you a reason to run toward something, not away from it." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her a brief, fierce meeting of lips that left Hope breathless. Then he was moving away, positioning himself behind a boulder at the entrance to the hollow. "Be ready," he called softly. The sound of horses and men's voices grew louder as Crawford and his men approached the ravine. Hope sat frozen in the wagon, torn between following Asher's instructions and refusing to leave him behind. "There's tracks leading in here," a voice called, not Crawford's, but one of his men. "Wagon tracks." "Check it out," came Crawford's reply. "But be careful. Blackwood's wounded, not dead." Footsteps crunched on the rocky ground as someone approached the ravine entrance. Hope held her breath, her hand tightening on the reins. Asher crouched behind his boulder, revolver ready. A figure appeared at the narrow entrance to the hollow, one of Crawford's men, rifle in hand. He spotted the wagon and raised his weapon. "They're here," he shouted. Asher fired, the shot echoing deafeningly in the confined space. The man fell, and immediately the ravine erupted with gunfire as Crawford and his remaining companion returned fire from outside. "Now, Hope," Asher yelled, positioning himself to provide covering fire. "Go." Heart pounding, Hope snapped the reins, urging the terrified horses forward. The wagon lurched toward the ravine entrance, gaining speed as the horses responded to her urgent commands. Bullets whined past as she drove straight toward Crawford and his remaining man, who scrambled to get out of the way of the charging team. Asher fired steadily from behind, forcing them to take cover instead of taking careful aim at Hope. The wagon burst from the ravine onto the open trail, the horses at full gallop. Hope risked a glance back to see Asher emerge, still firing, driving Crawford and his man further back from the ravine entrance. Then, to her horror, she saw Crawford raise his rifle and take deliberate aim. The shot cracked across the landscape, and Asher staggered, falling to one knee. "Asher!" Hope screamed, pulling hard on the reins. The wagon slowed, and Hope prepared to jump down to run back to him. But before she could move, Asher regained his feet and gestured frantically for her to keep going. "Run," he shouted. "I'll find you." Tears blurring her vision, Hope made the hardest decision of her life. She snapped the reins and drove on, leaving Asher behind to face Crawford alone. The sound of gunfire continued behind her as she pushed the team to their limits, the wagon bouncing dangerously over the rough trail. Only when the sounds of battle had faded completely did she slow the horses, allowing them to catch their breath as she wiped away her tears. "I'll find you," Asher had said. But would he? Could he possibly survive against Crawford and his man, wounded as he was? Hope drove on, determination gradually replacing despair. She would reach the Davis homestead as Martha had instructed. She would get to Lamy and board that eastbound train. And she would wait for Asher Blackwood to keep his promise and find her. Because for the first time in her life, Hope Taylor had someone worth waiting for. The Davis homestead appeared on the horizon as dusk was falling, a sturdy cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn and well-tended fields stretching toward a creek. As Hope approached, a man emerged from the barn, shotgun in hand. "Who goes there?" he called warily. "Hope Taylor," she replied, drawing the wagon to a halt. "Martha Jenkins sent me. I need help." At the mention of Martha's name, the man lowered his weapon. "I'm Caleb Davis," he said, approaching the wagon. "Where's Martha? Is there trouble?" Hope quickly explained the situation: Crawford's arrival at the Jenkins ranch, their flight, and the confrontation in the ravine. By the time she finished, Caleb's expression was grim. "Crawford," he spat. "Man's a menace," he gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. My wife will tend to you while I send my boy to alert the sheriff's men in Galisteo." The Davis family welcomed Hope with kindness and efficiency. Rebecca Davis, a motherly woman with capable hands, provided food and fresh clothes while their teenage son, Will, saddled a horse to ride to Galisteo. "What about Asher?" Hope asked anxiously as Rebecca set a bowl of stew before her. "We can't just leave him out there." "Will's taking a roundabout route to Galisteo," Caleb assured her. "He'll keep an eye out for your friend, and I'll ride back along your trail at first light." He patted the rifle leaning against the wall. "Crawford doesn't scare me." Despite his reassurances, Hope barely slept that night, her mind filled with images of Asher wounded and alone, or worse. By dawn, she was dressed and ready, determined to accompany Caleb on his search. "You should stay here," Caleb argued as he saddled his horse. "If Crawford's still out there, I'm coming," Hope stated firmly. "Asher risked his life for me. I won't sit safely by the fire while he might be dying." Something in her tone must have convinced Caleb of her resolve, for he nodded and proceeded to saddle a second horse. "Stay close," he instructed as they rode out. "And if there's trouble, you do exactly as I say." They retraced Hope's route from the previous day, riding cautiously, alert for any sign of Crawford or his men. The morning sun illuminated the landscape, making it seem impossibly peaceful despite the danger Hope knew lurked within it. As they approached the ravine where she had last seen Asher, Hope's heart pounded painfully in her chest. What would they find? She steeled herself for the worst, even as she prayed for a miracle. The entrance to the ravine showed signs of the fierce gunfight, bullet holes in the rocks, spent cartridges on the ground. But of Asher, Crawford, or the men who had accompanied him, there was no sign. "Blood here," Caleb noted, pointing to dark stains on the rocky ground. "Someone was hurt. Bad." Hope dismounted, examining the area with growing desperation. "Asher," she called, her voice echoing off the ravine walls. "Asher, are you here?" Only silence answered her. "Look," Caleb said, pointing to tracks leading away from the ravine. 3 horses heading west. "One rider seems unsteady in the saddle. See how the tracks waver?" "Crawford," Hope surmised. "Taking a wounded man with him." Her heart sank. Had Crawford captured Asher, or was it one of his own men who was wounded? Caleb studied the ground further. "And here," he said, indicating a different set of tracks. "One horse heading east. These tracks are fresher made after the others left." Hope's pulse quickened. "East, toward your homestead," Caleb nodded. "Whoever this was, they were following your trail." Hope didn't need to hear more. She remounted her horse in one fluid motion. "Let's go," she urged, already turning her mount eastward. "If it's Asher, he might be wounded. He needs help." They followed the solitary tracks, Hope's hope rising with each passing mile. The rider had indeed been heading directly toward the Davis homestead, staying close to the route the wagon had taken. They had ridden perhaps 3 miles when Caleb suddenly raised his hand, signaling Hope to stop. "Rider ahead," he murmured, pointing to a distant figure slumped over a horse's neck. Hope's heart leaped to her throat. Even at this distance, she recognized the broad shoulders, the dark hair. "Asher," she cried, urging her horse forward. As they drew closer, Asher raised his head weakly, his hand moving instinctively toward his holster before recognition dawned in his eyes. "Hope!" he called, his voice hoarse but unmistakable. Hope reached him first, pulling her horse alongside his. Asher was pale beneath the trail dust and stubble, blood staining his shirt where a fresh wound had torn through his left side. But he was alive, and the smile that touched his lips at the sight of her was the most beautiful thing Hope had ever seen. "You came back," he said softly, disbelief mingling with joy in his tone. "Of course I came back," Hope replied, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" "Hoped you wouldn't," Asher admitted weakly. "Crawford is heading west, according to his tracks," Caleb interjected, joining them. "Let's get you back to the homestead before you fall out of that saddle." They rode slowly, Hope staying close beside Asher, ready to catch him if he faltered. By the time they reached the Davis homestead, he was barely conscious, remaining upright through sheer will alone. Rebecca Davis took one look at Asher's condition and immediately took charge, directing Caleb and Hope to bring him into the house. "Bullet wound to the side," she observed clinically as they laid him on a bed in the spare room. "Clean through, but he's lost a lot of blood, and his earlier wound has reopened." While Rebecca worked on Asher's injuries, Hope paced anxiously in the kitchen, unable to sit still. Caleb watched her with understanding in his weathered face. "He's a tough one," he observed. "Most men wouldn't have made it 5 miles with those wounds, let alone tracked you all the way here." Hope nodded, drawing comfort from the observation. "He promised he'd find me," she said softly. "I should have known he would keep that promise, no matter what." "That kind of determination comes from somewhere deep," Caleb noted. "Not just duty or honor. Man rides through hell for a woman, he's got powerful feelings driving him." Before Hope could respond to this insight, Rebecca emerged from the spare room, wiping her hands on her apron. "He'll live," she announced without preamble. "Needs rest and care, but he's strong. The fever's mild and both wounds are clean." "Can I see him?" Hope asked anxiously. Rebecca nodded. "He's asking for you. Just keep it brief, he needs sleep more than conversation right now." Asher was propped against pillows when Hope entered the room, his torso wrapped in fresh bandages. Despite his pallor and evident exhaustion, his eyes brightened at the sight of her. "You're still here," he said, echoing his words from the Jenkins ranch. Hope moved to sit beside him on the edge of the bed. "I'm still here," she confirmed. "And so are you against all odds." "Crawford?" Asher asked, his expression sobering. "Heading west, according to Caleb," Hope replied. "What happened after I left?" Asher's jaw tightened at the memory. "He winged me with that first shot you saw, but I managed to hit his remaining man, killed him, I think. Crawford kept firing, pinned me down." He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. Then riders appeared from the East Sheriff's men from Galisteo, responding to the gunfire. Crawford decided to cut his losses and run. "And you decided to follow me instead of seeking help in Galisteo," Hope concluded, equal parts exasperated and touched. A ghost of a smile touched Asher's lips. "Made a promise, didn't I?" Hope reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "You could have died keeping that promise." "Would have been worth it," Asher replied simply, his blue eyes holding hers. "Found something worth living for, Hope, worth dying for too if it came to that." The raw honesty in his voice made Hope's heart swell. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his a gentle kiss that conveyed all the words she couldn't yet say. When she pulled back, Asher was watching her with wonder in his eyes. "Does this mean you'll stop running?" he asked softly. Hope smiled through gathering tears. "Depends on whether I have someone worth staying for." "You do," Asher assured her, squeezing her hand weakly. "If you'll have me." "I will," Hope whispered. "I will." 2 days later, Will Davis returned from Galisteo with news. Sheriff Daniels and his men had tracked Crawford to the Arizona border, but lost him in the rugged terrain. The bank robbery plot had been completely foiled, however, and several of Crawford's associates were in custody, facing trial. "Sheriff says the eastbound train tickets are still good," Will reported, handing Hope an envelope. "Says you should use them, get clear of the territory until Crawford's caught." Hope took the envelope. Thinking of the future, it represented a future away from the dangers of the New Mexico territory, but also away from the wild beauty of this land that had, despite everything, begun to feel like home. "What do you think?" she asked Asher that evening as they sat on the Davises' porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. His strength was returning slowly, though he still moved with careful deliberation. "About leaving." Asher clarified, his gaze thoughtful as it swept across the landscape. "Part of me doesn't want to give Crawford the satisfaction of driving us out." He turned to look at Hope. "But part of me thinks starting fresh somewhere else might not be such a bad idea. Together." Hope's heart warmed at the word. "Together," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "There's good land in Colorado," Asher suggested, "or we could go further east. Pennsylvania's beautiful in the fall." "You'd go back there, after all this time?" Hope asked, surprised. Asher shrugged, then winced slightly at the movement. "Been running from my own ghosts too long," he admitted. "Maybe it's time to face them." He took her hand, his touch gentle but secure. "With you beside me, I think I could face just about anything." Hope leaned against his uninjured shoulder, contentment washing over her despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead. "When do we leave?" "Train leaves Lamy in 3 days," Asher replied. "If I can ride by then." "And if you can't?" Hope asked, concerned. Asher smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then we wait until I can. No more rushing, Hope. We've got time now." 3 days later, with Asher deemed fit enough for travel by Rebecca Davis, they said goodbye to the family that had sheltered them. Caleb provided a wagon to take them to Lamy, insisting it was the least he could do. "You've done more than enough," Hope told him gratefully as they prepared to depart. "We can never repay your kindness." "No need," Caleb replied gruffly. "Just live well, the pair of you, that's payment enough." The journey to Lamy was uneventful, the landscape peaceful under the autumn sun. Hope sat close beside Asher on the wagon seat, occasionally stealing glances at his profile, still marveling that this remarkable man had chosen her. As if sensing her thoughts, Asher turned to meet her gaze, a smile warming his blue eyes. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. Hope shook her head firmly. "Not a single one," she assured him. "You." "Only about letting you drive," he teased, nodding toward the reins in her hands. "Might want to watch that rut ahead." Hope laughed, deftly guiding the team around the obstacle. "I'll have you know I'm an excellent driver, Mr. Blackwood." "Never doubted it for a moment, Miss Taylor," he replied, his expression sobering slightly. "Just as I never doubted you were worth finding, worth protecting." Hope's heart swelled with emotion. "And I never thought I'd find someone I'd stop running for," she said softly. "Until you." They reached Lamy by mid-afternoon, the small station quiet in the lull between trains. Their eastbound connection wouldn't arrive until evening, giving them several hours to rest and prepare for the journey ahead. As they sat on a bench outside the station, Watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon, Hope felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, wasn't planning her next escape. Instead, she was looking forward, toward a future that, while uncertain, was filled with promise. "Penny for your thoughts," Asher said, his arm resting comfortably around her shoulders. Hope smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. A week ago, I was running for my life, certain I'd never be safe again, and now. Asher prompted when she trailed off. "Now I'm heading east with a man I barely know, leaving behind everything familiar," Hope replied, marveling at her own transformation. "And I've never felt more right about anything." Asher's expression softened. "We've got time to know each other better," he assured her. "A lifetime, if you'll give me that long." Hope's breath caught at the implication in his words. "Asher Blackwood, is that a proposal?" A hint of color touched his cheeks, but his gaze remained steady. "Might be," he admitted. "Unless you think it's too soon, in which case I'm just making conversation." Hope laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "It's not too soon," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "Not when you're the first person who's ever made me want to stop running." Asher captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Hope replied without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." As the sun set over the New Mexico territory, casting long shadows across the land they were about to leave behind, Hope Taylor and Asher Blackwood sealed their promise with a kiss. They had found in each other what both had thought lost forever: hope, a shield against the world's dangers; Asher, a reason to emerge from solitude. And when the eastbound train arrived that evening, they boarded it not as fugitives fleeing danger, but as travelers embarking on a journey of their own choosing together. 5 years later, a crisp autumn day found Hope Blackwood standing on the porch of a sturdy farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, watching as her husband demonstrated to their 3-year-old son how to saddle a pony. Little Thomas, named for Asher's fallen friend, listened with solemn attention, his dark hair and blue eyes a perfect blend of his parents' features. "Not too tight," Asher instructed gently. "Horse needs to breathe, just like you and me." Hope smiled, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their second child grew. The years in Pennsylvania had been good to them. Asher had used his savings to purchase this farm near his hometown of Riverdale, and together they had built a life filled with hard work, simple joys, and deep love. Sheriff Daniels wrote occasionally with news from the New Mexico territory. Crawford had eventually been captured trying to rob a bank in Denver. He'd been sentenced to 20 years in prison, effectively ending his reign of terror in the Southwest. Sometimes, Hope found herself missing the wild beauty of New Mexico: the vast skies, the rugged mountains, the sense of freedom that came with that untamed land. But she never regretted their decision to leave. Here they had found peace, stability, and community. As Asher lifted Thomas onto the pony's back, holding him securely while the boy beamed with pride, Hope's heart swelled with gratitude. She had spent so many years running, never daring to hope for a place that felt truly like home. Now, watching her husband and son together, she knew with absolute certainty that home wasn't a place at all. It was the love they had built together, the family they had created. Asher looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. His smile, the same one that had first captivated her in that dusty canyon 5 years ago, still had the power to make her heart skip a beat. "Mama, look," Thomas called excitedly. "I'm riding." "I see you, sweetheart," Hope called back. "You're doing wonderfully." As Asher led the pony in a careful circle, his protective hand never leaving their son's back, Hope remembered his words from that desperate day in the ravine. "Let me give you a reason to run towards something, not away from it." He had done exactly that. And she had never stopped running toward the future they shared not for a single day since.